Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to University of Chicago, Hong Kong campus. My name is Intan Chen. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of this campus. We are sharing today's event live on YouTube, Zoom, and Facebook as well. So welcome to the audience on Zoom and the online platform. Tonight, we're happy to welcome back our Faculty Director, Professor Kenneth Pomeranz, to host the talk, Why is China So Big? Redefining the Qing realm and its subjects. Ken is University of Chicago Professor of Modern Chinese History and the College. He is also Faculty Director of this campus. His work focuses mostly in China. On China, he's also very interested in comparative and world history. Most of his research is on social, economic, and environmental history. He has worked on state formation, imperialism, religion, gender, and other topics as well. He has a variety of publications, some of which won the John K. Fairbank Prize, and a collection of his essays was recently published in France. Tonight, Ken will discuss the transformation of China's frontiers regions during the Qing dynasty and the linkage to its demographic and economic behavior changes. Thank you, Ken, for joining us tonight. Please welcome Professor Kenneth Pomeranz.
Thank you, Intan, and thank you, everybody, for being here. So this lecture is one small piece of a long manuscript called Why is China So Big? And I warn you, it's a rather long lecture. Roughly 1/5 of humanity has been one polity for much of the last 2,000 years and almost all of the last 700. Moreover, of the 6 states that cover 40% of the earth today, Russia, Canada, China, the United States, Brazil, and Australia, 5 of them benefited from what Alfred Crosby called ecological imperialism, in which 16th to 19th century settlers brought diseases to which natives had no resistance, and also brought plants and animals that had no enemies in their new homes, greatly facilitating conquest and colonization. Chinese expansion is the one that really basically lacked those supports, and that makes it even more striking. Today's People's Republic can also be seen as successor to one of several early modern multi-ethnic empires. The others, Mughal, Ottoman, Romanov, Habsburg, etc., all fractured into multiple states, as did Europe's overseas empire. But China today includes almost all of the Qing realm, despite a century of incursions by stronger powers. This creation and recreation of this unity matters for many reasons. So the talk tonight first discusses how Chinese elites came by roughly 1850 to see various areas that had been conquered by the Qing between 1683 and 1759, some of which had rarely or never before been ruled from China, as being domestic, that is, part of their own bounded territory. But it also invokes another meaning of domestic, meaning related to household matters. In this case, coming to see various frontiers as places where so-called good subjects, liangmin, could create proper families and thus communities. Part 2 then examines how these changing ideas played out in southwestern China in particular, from roughly 1857 to 1937. Here's another view of the expansion under the Qing. In his 1968 essay, The Chinese World Order, John Fairbank contrasted modern states, geographically limited, but fully sovereign within their boundaries, with a Chinese idea of universal empire, which Fairbank believed had endured from ancient times until Western impact. An empire centered on a son of heaven who, if properly virtuous, would be acknowledged by all under heaven. Now, that empire need not rule everyone directly. Outer regions might have their own rulers and offer only occasional tribute to the center. Moreover, actual rulers would never really rule by virtue alone. But in theory, the realm was an unbounded set of increasingly unenlightened concentric circles, as you see here. In 2007, Fairbank's very distinguished student, Alex Woodside, reconsidered this model in light of the by then booming field of borderland studies. He noted that the all under heaven framework defined the center quite precisely as the place from which civilization radiated outwards, but largely ignored borders. Outlying territories contributed nothing in this scheme, except that obedience confirmed the center's greatness. And the sign of success with faraway peoples was more that they, as the phrase went, turned towards civilization in symbolic ways, rather than by paying taxes, being counted in censuses, or actually following central government laws. Furthermore, Chinese political thought often viewed frontier entanglements as risky. Imperfect rulers who used force to subdue these disorderly regions risked expensive wars that would undermine the entire polity. Moreover, though Chinese rulers did sometimes seize frontier resources, they usually did so in order to avoid buying them from potential enemies. Central Asian horses are the classic example. The goal was reducing vulnerabilities, not generating growth. In short, frontiers were seen less as zones of opportunity than as problems to be managed. The most optimistic, idealistic visions imagined civilizing those frontiers, but that was for their own good, not the good of the center. These are oversimplifications. Chinese states drew sharp borders when it suited them, and at least de facto, they often treated some other states as equals. Moreover, the idea of one universal empire embodying the one universal civilization was not only routinely compromised in practice, it had also been balanced since very early times, even in theory, by assertions that some peoples and some places were uncivilizable. In particular, Chinese elites often argued that where you couldn't farm, people would be nomads who didn't have property, tend graves, etc., and so would always be barbarous and untrustworthy. That view appears even in some pre-imperial texts and really solidified in Sima Qian's Shiji historical records, which was completed roughly in 91 BCE, soon after major Han triumphs over nomadic enemies. It became a model for most subsequent Chinese history writing, and it portrayed what were in reality often very fluid relations between the steppe and the zone regions as eternally hostile. Bangu, writing about a century later, provided this often quoted formulation. Barbarians have a human face and beasts' hearts. They follow their herds across the grassland and hunt for a living. They are separated from us by mountains and gorges and barred by the desert. Therefore, the sage kings treated them as beasts and birds, did not make treaties with them, and were not engaged in offensive expeditions. If you make a treaty with them, they spend the gifts and then deceive you. If you attack them, then the army is exhausted and you induce banditry. Later scholars also said that the environment limited northern tribes in particular to occupations which precluded civilization. Pictures of southerners were more varied. Those areas were at least well-watered and so potentially arable. So some literati and officials had higher hopes for civilizing them. For centuries, maps generally showed sharp borders in the north, but rarely in the south. Here's one such map, and here's another. But if only arable areas could support civilization, then civilization had some pretty clear limits. Here are three ways of looking at that. This is an elevation map, a precipitation map, and then an artist's rendition that sort of combines the two. And those limits were arguably reached when Manchuria and Taiwan were absorbed in the 1600s. 18th century expansion, focused on Central Asia, was different. Essentially seen by Han elites at the time as forward defense against peoples forever alien in lands eternally unattractive, where deep, lasting engagement was probably unwise. Historians used to think that this view didn't really change until almost 1900, when imperialist pressures led to a sudden surge of nationalism and inspired defensive colonization efforts. Recent research has added that concerns about securing frontier mineral resources for newly critical military and industrial projects emerged starting around 1890, also inspiring colonization schemes. By the 1920s, some people imagined Mongolia accommodating 80 million Chinese settlers. Sun Yat-sen, somewhat more realistically, proposed 10 million settlers. And these fantasies were not a particularly Chinese disorder. An English military strategist estimated in 1932 that an irrigated southern Xinjiang could accommodate 160 million residents. It's highly irrigated today and has about 11 million people. But attributing everything to an anti-imperialist awakening around 1900 misses a crucial prelude and exaggerates the role of external stimuli. Gradual, homegrown changes in conceptualizing frontiers began much earlier and made the later developments possible. But before tracing those changes, I should sketch more of the baseline from which they occurred, tracing ideas about migration, which complemented the above ideas about borderland governance. One time-honored truism about traditional Chinese notions of ethnicity and nationality is that they were culturalist rather than biological or racial. In other words, the idea was that somebody with the proper lifestyle could be effectively Chinese, regardless of their phenotype. This culturalism does echo through the classics, with stories of ancient sage kings from barbarian lands, for instance, and it suggested that frontier peoples could indeed be Sinified. Now that should also have meant that there was no shame in having so-called uncivilized ancestors. It might make them even more honorable to have embraced civilization by choice. And a great many leading families did have mixed or non-Han origins. In fact, many of today's Han people in South China in particular can be shown by many kinds of evidence, including now by DNA, to descend from assimilated indigenous peoples. This is a rather complicated map, but basically what it shows you is that most people in the North who are categorized today as Han actually have more genetically in common with the people in the North who are considered non-Han than they do in the South, with the people in the South who are considered Han. And those people in the South, in turn, have more in common with local minorities than they do with the Northern Han. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basics. Interestingly, though, almost no genealogy admits this, at least when it comes to male ancestors. Instead, socially ambitious families in Central and South China consistently claim descent from accomplished men who fled China's heartland during either a barbarian conquest or a government collapse. Both the origin and the occasion of flight in these stories are significant. The ancestors did not go to the frontier in search of opportunities beyond what the core normally offered, but to preserve civilization when it was temporarily absent from the core. Of course, such ideas hadn't stopped millions of people from going to frontiers for personal opportunity, especially during the Qing. But they show how much intellectual change the 20th century's enthusiasm for frontier colonization represented, right? How different an idea of the frontier as zone of opportunity was from an older one in which you only went there in the event of disaster. Now, part of the story behind that cultural and intellectual change was deeply ironic. The Manchu rulers of the Qing made the Northwest frontier seem tamer by winning China's biggest victories there in a millennium, combining Chinese and Central Asian military and political techniques to destroy once threatening Mongols. The Qing were also enabled by a crucial coincidence, namely Russia's simultaneous expansion eastward. These rivals were also de facto partners, negotiating fixed borders and agreeing to prevent cross-border violence. Thus, steppe peoples could no longer retreat indefinitely, and therefore could finally be decisively defeated. Here you see the Dzungar Mongols in particular basically being squeezed from both sides in a way that makes it impossible for them to practice their old tactic of simply retreating when faced with overwhelming force. Now, Chinese elites did not initially consider these newly conquered lands to be part of their empire. When fighting ended in 1759, many Han officials and intellectuals recommended withdrawing from what is now Xinjiang, seeing it as not worth ruling. There's Xinjiang. But after 1820s unrest in Xinjiang was suppressed, statecraft-oriented Han Chinese intellectuals, who had gradually become far more involved in studying and governing frontier regions, uniformly rejected retreat. And this is sort of striking because if you think about it, in 1759, they basically tell the emperor, this place is not worth governing. It's too expensive. There's nothing to be gained there. 70 years later, they've basically been proved right. And the Qing spent a fortune putting down those 1820s uprisings, and they'd never gotten much out of the place. But rather than saying, hey, we were right all along, they turn around and instead say, oh no, we absolutely have to stay there. In fact, several of them, most famously Gongzejun, argued for enlarging Xinjiang's garrisons. And to fund this, they recommended bypassing the region's non-Han elites and instituting direct rule, funded by immigration, which they said would lead to economic expansion. By 1830, the Qing were in fact too weak to do most of this, but they did begin promoting immigration to the far northwest rather than impeding it. They licensed more mining in northern frontier areas, and they took some other steps. And crucially, the strong Han elite support for expansionist plans, even as the dynasty fell into crisis with the Opium Wars and mid-19th century civil wars, showed that they now saw Xinjiang as at least potentially civilized and not to be abandoned. Reinforcing this, the Qing began replacing local Xinjiang place names with names recalling long-gone Chinese outposts in Central Asia. So conquering it with words, if not in reality. Settling it with words, if not in reality. Another manifestation of this rethinking was a shift in language, referring to the dynasty's entire territory as Zhongguo. That term, literally meaning central country or middle kingdom, today, of course, simply means China. Gongzejun, for instance, began his famous essay on Xinjiang in a striking but illogical fashion. He begins by saying, there are many countries under heaven, but none is as large as our great Qing, a formulation that sounds more like a modern notion of inherently plural, bounded territorial states than any notion of even potentially universal empire. He then continues, the country of the great Qing is that which has been called Zhongguo since the time of the mythical sage King Yao. The territory it occupies in the east and north is bordered by the sea. In the north and west, it does not reach the sea, but written agreements can be cited, and on and on. The written agreements are the 1689 and 1727 treaties with Russia, and Gong refers soon after to the Qing expanding beyond all previous dynastic borders. So he obviously knew that this had not always been Chinese territory. In nonetheless equating all of Qing territory to the setting of China's classical past, he essentially sacralized his era's borderlands, making them something that any heir of Chinese culture should want to keep. Gong's move resembles similar grabs for ancient glories by modern nationalists elsewhere, but there's no evidence that Gong was aware of any of those equivalent moves that were being made by nationalists elsewhere. It's a parallel, not an influence. Now, for Han literati to equate all of Qing territory with an ancient Zhongguo was important, but not entirely original. Qing rulers had done it first, not consistently, and mostly in diplomatic contexts, but often enough to lay the groundwork for what became routine claims that all Qing territory was China, even after the Qing were gone. But if the whole Qing realm was Zhongguo, then Zhongguo seemed to have some parts that were not suitable for direct rule and civilization, including not only the Northwest, but much of Yunnan and Guizhou, which the Ming had claimed, but not actually ruled. Efforts in the 1720s and 30s to institute direct rule in the Southwest, replacing tributary chieftains with regular officials, sparked bloody conflicts, and the Qing largely withdrew in defeat. The next 60 years saw most of these chieftains reinstated, while gradually imposing more supervision and Chinese education on them. This was often accompanied by trying to ban immigrants from the chieftains' areas, lest they destabilize things by introducing social change. There was even more hesitancy about immigration to the semi-arid northern borderlands. The Qing did want southwestern minerals, especially copper, for their currency, but that didn't require direct rule. Indeed, where the Qing saw only non-agricultural resources, they sometimes preferred indirect rule, with chieftains providing the desired goods as tribute. While various frontier officials claimed that indigenous miners were inferior to Chinese, the court generally considered such inefficiencies an acceptable price for avoiding the unrest that an influx of Han miners might cause. Now, of course, many societies, not just China, valorized farming over other occupations, but that preference was especially strong in China. Cosmologically, agriculture, like sacrifice, was a way that people connected heaven and earth, which is what humans were supposed to do. Miners, however, were said to, quote, gouge the veins of the earth. More practically, non-agricultural work was considered unlikely to promote stable residence or provide enough income to form families. And miners, loggers, etc., were indeed mostly single men. For complicated reasons, China had very few full-time wage laborers for a highly commercial society. Circa 1800, less than 15% of workers got most of their income from wages. Moreover, agricultural laborers earned much less than even most tenants, perhaps a third as much on average, and still less compared to people who actually owned their own farms. Since employers seeking non-agricultural unskilled labor only had to pay slightly more than the farm wage, and that farm wage was about a third of what tenants earned, entry-level miners, loggers, porters, etc., also typically earned much less than either tenants or smallholders. That made it very hard for them to be household heads, especially since sex-selective infanticide plus concubinage created a permanent shortage of marriageable women, and it was, of course, the poorest men who tended to lose out. This also helps explain why the wage-earning population didn't grow over time. There were always some people falling into the wage-earning class, but if the last generation of wage earners often didn't reproduce themselves, then the number of people at the bottom stays small. People without wives or descendants were considered dangerous, reinforcing their marginality in a vicious cycle. They also tended to move around a lot, thus avoiding registration. Mines, generally being poorly capitalized, closed frequently, 60% within 5 years in one good sample from Yunnan. Forests were often cut and abandoned quickly. In short, so-called liumin, translated as drifters or perhaps vagrants, were seen as sliding downwards from being liangmin, good subjects, perhaps having already become irredeemable. And elites using this term rarely distinguished mobile workers from unemployed vagrants. Inviting such people into frontiers was seen as asking for trouble. To the extent that the court wanted migrants to frontiers, they wanted solid farm families who would bring proper Chinese ways with them and not mix too much with locals, much less imitate them. By contrast, the Qing feared single men, both for their alleged rowdiness, but also, interestingly, because some of them married locals and partly acculturated. The term Han trader, Hanjian, which occurs with increasing frequency in documents about the 18th century Southwest, interestingly referred both to Han who clashed with the indigenes and with Han who became too close to them. Either way, you were considered to be a destabilizing force. Now, some people did advocate migration to frontiers, especially in the early 1700s, but both official and elite opinion had turned strongly against this after assimilationist policies in the Southwest produced rebellions in the 1730s. After completing the conquest of Xinjiang in 1759, the emperor himself asked about possibly encouraging Han settlement, but nobody supported the idea. For the next several decades, most non-soldiers settling in Xinjiang were actually exiled criminals. Southwestern policy varied more, but was still quite consistent in opposing single male migrants. Theoretically, they were supposed to be captured and removed. It was actually illegal for them to settle in these places. And in fact, on paper, a magistrate who was found to have single male migrants who had settled in his district could be removed from office, though I found no evidence that that ever actually happened. Things began to change around 1800 in both Northwest and Southwest. Shan Yao circulated an essay which advocated filling up Xinjiang with impoverished Chinese immigrants, both to help hold on to Xinjiang and to let these people remake themselves into good subjects with proper families. Others made similar arguments and surveyed the territory, identifying suitable spots for settlement. By 1827, as I noted before, Geng Zizhen was publicly arguing for the first time in decades that Han vagrants, he used the term, should actually be especially encouraged to move to Xinjiang, where both agricultural and other work could make good subjects of them, while financing stronger garrisons and a civil administration like that in the core provinces. Even more important than Geng's specific recommendations is what his argument erases. It erases the idea that the line between farming and non-farming areas represented an impassable limit of civilized society and Chinese-style rule. One change that helped make this imaginable had been slowly unfolding ever since the conquest, and that's non-agricultural sedentarization. Many Mongols, for instance, had become something like ranchers, moving much less than they used to, and reporting their population and herd sizes to Qing officials. So when Gongzi Zhen proposed animal husbandry as one of many non-farming occupations that impoverished Han immigrants could pursue in Xinjiang, he did not envision them becoming nomadic, which is why such a move could be considered civilizing rather than the opposite. Developments elsewhere in the empire were also eroding the idea that sedentary equals agricultural equals civilized. Around 1800, rebellions by both immigrants and indigenous people rocked central and southwestern China. This stimulated new ideas about how to secure peace, especially in mountainous areas, which had been rebel strongholds. Meanwhile, early Qing hopes that remote highlands could be kept empty had become impractical as the population soared. Stabilizing the Southwest, therefore, required filling the mountains with good subjects. And since those who already had farms elsewhere were unlikely to move uphill voluntarily, one needed to stabilize the lives of mobile, non-agricultural people. When the official and essayist Yen Rui discussed how to prevent various recently pacified forested highlands, which still harbored smugglers and fugitives, from spawning renewed unrest, he argued against trying to farm them. He rightly saw this as likely to cause rapid erosion and thus as unsustainable. Instead, Yen supported peopling these highlands with loggers, miners, paper makers, and other traditionally disfavored kinds of workers. Here's the key. He favored it as long as those enterprises could be rendered stable enough that these workers would stay put. Again, the key is not to be mobile. What he wanted to avoid was a situation in which these kinds of workers would reap the site's lowest hanging fruit and then move on. If these people settled down, Yen argued, they could become properly registered subjects who would form stable families and lineages, tend ancestral graves, pay taxes, join community compacts, which made them responsible for each other's behavior, and even raise future candidates for the civil service. It was social strategies like these, Yen claimed, that had raised militia that had defeated the rebels after conventional armies failed. Other Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou officials claimed during the period from the 1810s to the 1840s that similar methods were keeping their jurisdictions orderly. Wu Qijun, famous governor general of Yunnan and Guizhou in the 1840s, even claimed that when miners, loggers, and so on were governed properly, which in his view included giving them loans to help them stabilize their businesses, that when that was done, these men were better candidates for stabilizing the frontier than farmers because their settlements were larger. He designated mine owners to lead community compacts and militia, effectively delegating grassroots government to them. And this was a huge conceptual shift from traditional notions that community organizations should consist of farmers led by Confucian gentlemen. The idea that merchants of all people, mine developers, which should be the community leaders, was not something that traditional Chinese thought was very prone to. Though in practice, Wu was often just recognizing the existing self-government of extractive workers' communities. We found a lot of evidence in recent years of mining communities in particular that had their own self-government institutions that Qing officials just didn't talk about. They knew they were there. They relied on them, but it wasn't a good idea to admit that they knew they were there. Now, this rethinking was limited. Farming retained a privileged ideological status, but non-farmers could now more easily be so-called good subjects, and their frontier settlements outposts of civilization. In denying that the limits of agriculture were also limits of the civilized polity, these thinkers were not restoring an ancient idea of universal empire that could go everywhere. On the contrary, as already noted, Gongzejun and the Qing themselves increasingly assumed territorial borders in roughly the modern sense. These two trends helped to make the unprecedentedly large outline of the multi-ethnic Qing, which, as noted before, and here's an example again, is almost the outline of today's People's Republic, compatible with long-standing ideas of a unified, culturally based polity. While mass nationalism still lay very much in the future, this rethinking allowed early and mid-19th century thinkers to associate an imagined community that traced its origins to Yao and other ancient Chinese heroes with a territory roughly double what could have been even loosely considered Chinese as recently as 1680. It thus helped prepare the late Qing and the Republic that followed to meet a test that Romanov, Habsburg, and Ottoman official nationalisms failed. What Benedict Anderson called stretching the short, tight skin of the nation over the gigantic body of the empire. And it helped people imagine that an enlarged frontier presence might be financially sustainable, a cautious but crucial step towards 20th century visions of frontiers as potential El Dorados. Those 20th century schemes for filling Xinjiang, Mongolia, et cetera, with millions of migrants that I mentioned earlier, consciously echoing parallel efforts in semi-arid but irrigable zones from Australia and California to Punjab and Kazakhstan, bore little immediate fruit in the capital-poor, war-torn Republic of China, but they left behind plans with great influence on post-1949 projects. Dreams of mass frontier settlement also went with a further shift in thinking about the frontiersmen themselves. By the 1920s, they were often portrayed not just as potential good subjects, and even that was an improvement from the way they'd been portrayed in the early Qing, but as the hardy vanguard of the nation, who by extracting resources China needed from harsh environments, while leaving the supposedly effete and over-civilized lands of China proper behind, were both rescuing the nation and, in 20th century social Darwinist language, revitalizing the race. In contrast to these long-run outcomes, what the Qing period figures I focused on here took were mostly steps towards rethinking the realm. As we know, Gongzejun and others wrote about the importance of tightening control over China's far west just before a century in which the Qing, and then the Republic, would have tremendous difficulty just holding their core territories against a variety of internal rebels and foreign invaders. But those crises made the appearance of new rationales for holding on to territories to which elites had had no attachment just a few decades earlier, even more significant. Without the reorientation we've discussed tonight, one can easily imagine either a Qing withdrawal from its most remote territories amidst the tumult of the 19th century, or a situation in which the new, often racialized Han Chinese nationalism of the 20th century might have walked away from various non-Han parts of the Manchu Imperium, treating them as more trouble than they were worth. Instead, of course, they doubled down on dominating those places. And they did implement some concrete expansionist plans even before 1949, especially in the mineral-rich Southwest. More generally, the increasingly pro-settler orientation of the 19th century had very different short-run and long-run results. In the short run, the results of a closer alignment between the Qing state and frontier migrants were catastrophic, partly because in early 19th century Yunnan and Guizhou finally got large numbers of the farm families whom earlier officials had thought would be preferable immigrants. Beginning around 1800, floods, droughts, and violence in Hunan and Jiangxi in particular finally did cause many landowning families to head to Yunnan and Guizhou. Officials were much more sympathetic to these disaster victim families than to the earlier single drifters. And you can see the change into much more sympathetic language in the official records. And they usually supported them in disputes with locals, disputes which became increasingly frequent, precisely because these migrants sought scarce farmland, arrived in sizable groups, since disasters displaced a lot of them all at once, as opposed to the sort of slow drip, drip, drip of the single men who had come before. They didn't intermarry with locals, and so they kept their identities as people from Nadi, or the heartland. Thus, they were actually much more destabilizing than the vagrants whom officials had feared. As officials increasingly sided with these particularly aggressive settlers, the local population, interestingly, including many earlier Han migrants who had integrated with indigenous society, became desperate. The resulting Panthay Rebellion of 1856 in Yunnan took 17 years to suppress and cost millions of lives, ending with massacres by Han militia, targeting the region's Muslims above all, that seemed unlikely to produce lasting peace. And a decade later, as if this wasn't enough, French troops invaded the Southwest, extracting significant concessions. Among these concessions were rights to live, trade, preach, etc., in a place called Mengzi, the main town in a tin-rich area where indigenous people lived under so-called native chieftains. Officials feared a cascade of further problems. A foreign traveler had been attacked a few years earlier in this area, leading to gunboat diplomacy and forced concession. In sum, the Qing had become more ideologically committed to holding their far frontiers, but this had provoked violent resistance, and their actual grip was weakening, both for that reason and for others. But then something very surprising happened. Over the next 60+ years, all the way down to 1945, ethnic violence declined sharply in the Southwest, while bit by bit, provincial governments increased their control over frontier areas, especially those that had been governed by so-called native chieftains during the Ming and the first part of the Qing. And while provincial governments were often substantially independent of the central government, especially in the early 20th century, they were ultimately reintegrated into it, so that by the end of World War II, there was a far stronger chain of command stretching from the capital to grassroots communities on the Yunnan, Guizhou, and Guangxi frontiers than ever before in Chinese history. How did that happen? In part, this was possible because when immigration to the region resumed after the rebellions, it looked much more like that of the 1680s to 1780s than like that of the 1790s to the 1850s. On the one hand, there were fewer disasters in the Middle Yangtze region after the Taiping Rebellion, and there was far more vacant land there because the Taiping had killed so many people. Thus, Hunan and Jiangxi farm families no longer went to the southwest in large groups. On the other hand, Yunnan mining surged again after 1880, at first largely through private initiative, and after about 1920, with money and technical aid from the province. As before, the mines mostly drew single immigrants who were likely to either remain within largely self-governing mining enclaves, or, after making some money in those mines, to marry local women, settling into local societies in dribs and drabs on terms involving mutual acculturation. The other important Han immigrants in this period were merchants, who also tended to come as individuals, to marry local women, and, according to both local and foreign observers, often took on local ways at least as much as they challenged them. This demographic, economic, and social history helps explain why the post-1873 absorption of minority areas in the Southwest had a better chance of succeeding peacefully than, say, those in Xinjiang and Mongolia. But it didn't ensure success. Formidable obstacles remained, especially since Southwestern provinces, like other frontier administrations, lost their long-standing central government subsidies after 1895, as foreign indemnities, military modernization, and new priorities like railway building consumed Qing and Republican budgets. In various northern frontier regions, these post-1895 fiscal pressures directly triggered ethnic conflict. For instance, cash-strapped officials in Mongolia and Xinjiang encouraged more rapid displacement of herders by farmers wherever the water supply allowed it. And they demanded more revenue and uncompensated labor from both Han and non-Han in areas where they didn't have this option. So why were things relatively peaceful on the southwestern frontier? Granted, the Southwest subsidies shrank less than Mongolia's and Xinjiang's, having been smaller to begin with, but that is far from the whole story. Yunnan's post-rebellion administration drew heavily on the victorious loyalist armies. These were not regular army units, which mostly performed poorly, but mostly the forces of a man named Sun Yuying, who was a minor Guangxi notable and militia leader before being summoned to Yunnan. In today's terms, Sun was a sinicized member of the Zhuang minority, though in fact the term Zhuang doesn't get used really in the Qing. His direct ancestors included Tusa native chieftains whose posts had been abolished in 1666, while some more distant paternal relatives were still involved in Guangxi and Guizhou chieftainships. This is a Tusa leader's compound, a relatively big one. Moreover, some sons who were no longer native officials now held other low-level, informally hereditary positions, as for instance, village headmen or officers at local garrisons. Sun's father passed the lowest civil service exam, giving him some local stature, but he rose no higher. Nor did Sun, until the mid-century rebellions prompted calls for local elites to organize militia, which often really meant recognizing militia that already existed. Sun's pre-1853 doings are a bit murky, but we do know he ran a mine in Yunnan, just across the provincial border from his hometown, and that he formed his first militia there. Thus, Sun fits our story about the Qing coming to accept people like miners and mine merchants as good subjects who could be entrusted with local power. The sons certainly fit a second story about ethnic and administrative change. We used to write as if frontier areas were either run by these so-called tusi or by centrally appointed bureaucrats, as if that was a binary choice. And early Qing attempts to install regular officials instead of these tusi were or were not successfully resisted, maintaining native control. But actually, in-between outcomes were common. Many tusi kept their positions, but were gradually subjected to more supervision and forced to share authority. Others lost their posts, but received minor privileges and positions that were no longer ethnically marked. They became tax collectors, garrison officers, etc. They were not really ousted, and they were not still independent, but they were co-opted, not eliminated. This trend resumed after the rebellions, rewarding tusi and other indigenous elites who had proved loyal. Sun offers an excellent example. After winning some skirmishes in 1853, he became an assistant magistrate. As his forces grew, he was rapidly promoted. Except for one brief posting to Taiwan and leaves to mourn his parents, Sun served in Yunnan and Guizhou for the rest of his life, dying as Yungui Governor General, which is about as high as you can get, in 1889. Like the more famous Han Chinese founders of loyalist personal armies in the 19th century, Sun gained unprecedented influence over the positions beneath him. Many other Suns filled low-level posts in post-1860 Yunnan and Guizhou, and Sun is a pretty uncommon surname. So it's really, really unlikely that this sudden flood of people who have that surname, just as the big guy with that surname becomes governor, is coincidence. In particular, Sun's Guangxi troops became the mainstays of his administration. Like post-rebellion officials elsewhere, he disbanded regular forces that had performed poorly, creating smaller, better-trained units out of his Guangxi followers, retrained militia, and so-called native troops. He established garrisons in various tusi-ruled areas, inserting commanders that he knew. These included both Han frontiersmen and members of former tusi lineages from Guangxi and Guizhou, like himself. And at one crucial moment, Sun capitalized on his troops' indigenous origins. As I noted earlier, the Sino-French War resulted in the opening of an entrepot at Mengzi, near the Indo-Chinese border, Indochina being French-ruled at the time. Sun joined others in worrying that local leaders could not protect the foreigners from so-called ignorant natives, although a pre-war French visitor had actually remarked on how orderly the mining settlements near Mengzi were. Sun successfully insisted on establishing a new garrison at Mengzi, which would also oversee the new customs station. Moreover, Sun argued, because this area was miasmal, which we usually translate as malarial, only people used to this environment, in other words, people like his own troops from Guangxi, could staff this station. This is, I think, the only place in Sun's 3,500 pages of memorials that he explicitly played the ethnic card, saying, hey, remember, I'm an ethnic minority from Guangxi and I have special skills that you need. And it worked because it got him and his successors control of this garrison and of vital revenues that passed through it. After 1910, Mengzi became a key station on the Haiphong, Hanoi, Kunming Railway, and it became the railhead for lucrative nearby mines. One 1930s estimate claimed that towns along this rail line held 80% of the province's commercial capital. Garrisoning Mengzi thereby catalyzed a process by which men of the region, though not of the locality, gradually brought borderland resources under provincial control and established more standard administration. This was jump-started, as we have just seen, in response to French demands. Later steps were also often catalyzed by foreign pressures. In 1897, Yunnan created so-called commissioners with jurisdiction over nearby, mostly non-Han areas. Their initial responsibility was managing security and liaison with foreign consuls, but they gradually added other functions as well. The networks from which Sun drew for local administration reached up to his governor's office and were loosely linked through him to Beijing. But ironically, they drew heavily from the Guangxi native chieftain system to overshadow Yunnan's native chieftains. Moreover, that network gained its foothold partly by invoking the same disease environment that had long helped shield native chieftains from provincial officials' power. Looking upwards from frontier localities, these were steps towards centralization. Although the military leaders who led post-rebellion regional machines in China's heartland are often seen as decentralizers, and even as part of the slide towards post-Qing warlordism. Sun operated on a shoestring, and he never influenced empire-wide politics as much as his peers in richer regions. But he built an administrative machine spanning 2 provinces and reaching the grassroots in key locales. Here you see a list of military positions in Yunnan held by people basically from the Southwest before and after the big rebellion. And you can see this enormous jump in the percentage who come from the Southwest. And here's civil positions, same sort of thing. A so far incomplete tabulation suggests that far more medium and lower level officials came from Yunnan, Guizhou, or Guangxi after the Panthay Rebellion than before. There were also more low-level officials from Hunan, the main source of pre-rebellion immigrants and of extra-provincial anti-rebel forces besides Sun Yuying's. In Xishuangbanna and other particularly remote areas, Sun and his successors installed some officials answering to Kunming, but dismissed very few of the local chieftains. The chieftains still led many military units, though sometimes within armies that were now led by outsiders at higher levels. This paid off when it was these native forces that crushed a 1908 uprising by revolutionary infiltrators from Vietnam. Modernizing military reforms continued thereafter, but so-called native forces and officers remained important in Yunnan all the way down into the 1940s. Civil administrative reform generally retained the native chieftains while building new structures around them. The so-called commissioners, created to deal with the French, gradually acquired larger staffs, more revenue, and more responsibilities. In particular, they took over many legal cases previously decided by the native chieftains. Republican-era commissioners also established some schools, clinics, and police forces, and built some roads. They limited Tusa authority to impose forced labor, and they undertook the first, although rather patchy, census in Yunnan's native areas. The Tusa themselves often became low-level members of both civil and military hierarchies. While many of the chieftains thereby kept significant local power, their rivalry with new officials was not a zero-sum game. Yunnan's government as a whole was gaining more knowledge and control of its border regions. Now, this was almost entirely provincial level state building, because the Southwest was pretty close to independent from 1915 to 1938. But the nationalist government was able to take advantage of this when Japan's 1937 invasion forced it into the far interior, and it basically inherited control of the provincial machinery that had been slowly built over the previous several decades. Thus, Yunnan's relatively steady gradualism worked much better than the alterations of accelerator and brake that provoked recurrent uprisings in places like Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Eastern Tibet. But differences much deeper than just policy choices had made this possible. In fact, the Southwest's post-1870 state builders were lucky. The nearby colonial powers, Britain and France, were threatening enough to necessitate firmer border control and commercially aggressive enough to stimulate growth and infrastructure building, but they were ultimately much less threatening than Russia or Japan on the northern borders. The post-Taiping Middle Yangtze stopped sending the most disruptive kinds of migrants, those farmer disaster refugees who arrived in huge numbers in the first half of the 19th century. Mineral wealth made provincial state building fiscally viable, although barely, and allowed the provincial government to wean itself from the opium revenues that had helped fund its earliest reforms. The transition to mineral revenues and some other commercial taxes like alcohol and tobacco levies had, by the 1930s, largely freed Kunming's aspiring provincial technocrats from dependence on rural landlords, many of whom were the former native chieftains. And though 20th century policymakers often spoke a new language of Chinese nationalism, in fact, they built on Qing legacies of co-optation and mutual adjustment. Far from equal, but mutual nonetheless. Yunnan's 18th century middle ground, its heritage of at least limited cooperation between immigrants and indigenes, often created outside the scope of state scrutiny, was long gone. But as it turned out, it was still relevant to the region's political development and its much smoother integration into China than we see in the Northwest. Thank you. So as I threatened, that was a fairly long talk, but we still have close to half an hour for questions.
Thank you, Professor Pomeranz, for a sweeping presentation of China's frontier and its development. I'll be kidding myself and you that I grasped all the fine points that you made. But I do want to comment on a couple of points that I grasped. You imply that it was the Qing dynasty and the literati that changed China policy, how to manage the frontier from remote detachment, to finally imperially sanctioned official nationhood, bringing them to a member of China. That almost sounds too easy, okay? They're almost like discussing the American expansion from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific without mentioning how the Native American were treated. Along that line, the people in the frontier affected, they were subjugated brutally in a time, I would say, genocidal massacre. Mm. You must be aware of the 1757 the Surodo uprising, where Emperor Qinlong decreed that they all be persecuted, executed, resulting in 80% of population of the Sangorian disappeared, right? And very quickly, they treat the vacuum by massive immigration of Hans, Uyghurs, Kazakh, and so on. And the same repeat in the Muslim insurrection in 1868, right? So my point is, you present one side of the coin, where somehow the other side of the coin was happily ignored.
Oh, no.
Now,
Certainly
another
not.
point I made is that your narrative that there was a change in the policy that invite the Xinjiang to the family is at odds with the orthodox narrative now, which means Xinjiang and its people were connected to China since the beginning of time. So there wasn't some change in literati or Qing dynasty official that welcomed the Xinjiang into the family of China. So I'd like to comment on those 2 points: how the frontier people are treated, and how your narrative is at odds with the current official orthodoxy.
Okay, so on the second point you make, I completely agree, right? The point is, in fact, to contrast with the current official narrative, which is very much a narrative in which China simply receives people. And that narrative, I think, does dangerously obscure the violence that's involved. You are absolutely right that in what is today northern Xinjiang in particular, there were enormous massacres. In fact, I think the best estimate of the death toll is more like 90% of the Dzungars, even above 80. And that there was a significant immigration that followed immediately from that vacuum. But even so, after that was over, there were still not nearly enough Han in the province to make the province pay. The Qing, year after year after year, lost money trying to hold on to this place. In a peaceful year, about 10% of Qing spending went to cover the deficit of Xinjiang alone, right? And given that Xinjiang was, maybe 1% of the total population, that's a big deal. And in years when there was violence, and there were a number of those years, that number went through the roof. So the Qing had an ongoing problem. And the way they saw it for a long time was that it was a problem that they didn't have a way out of, right? They simply could not see a way to make Xinjiang pay for itself. What I was trying to highlight is that between roughly 1760 and 1830, they begin to think their way around to a possible solution. A solution from their point of view, obviously, not from the solution from the perspective of the people who already lived there, right? Because they begin to imagine a way in which people could inhabit that region and live in what they considered to be civilized ways. That's this intellectual turnaround that is then the prelude to the much stronger push in the late 19th and 20th century that creates the dominance we see today. And I certainly by no means wanted to deny that that's what it is, right? I mean, I said, right, they double down on dominating these places. Dominating is not a term that means, oh, everybody was happy about it. People certainly were not. What I wanted to point to is that from the point of view of the most powerful actor in the region, right, there's this huge shift in thinking. And that significantly, that shift, I think, happens in the Qing and not, as many scholars would tell you, happens at the very end of the 19th century and in the 20th century as the Chinese begin adopting Western-style nationalism, right? So, another part of the orthodox narrative And actually, this is one in which the Orthodox narrative and the most common Western narrative actually agree, has been to say that, you know, China is an empire and it doesn't really make much attempt to penetrate deeply into these areas until the 20th century, right? When it begins to imitate the practices of other nations. Western scholars tend to emphasize the exploitative side of that. The official Qing narrative, the official PRC narrative minimizes that and says, you know, the 20th century is when we stopped collaborating with the native elites and instead united with the masses in these places, right? And what I want to say is both those stories miss the fact that something big was changing way before the Qing start learning, for better or worse, from 20th century styles of nationalism, that they'd already begun within the terms of more traditional Chinese thought, terms that talked in terms of things like good subjects versus bad subjects, and talked in terms of the preferability of agricultural lifestyles as the only truly civilized ones, that already within that frame, they'd begun to rethink their relationship to their frontiers, and that rethinking was a necessary prelude to the more radical shift in the 20th century, because it's in the 20th century that they get the muscle to actually do this. But it was before that that they began to rethink the reasons why they might want to do this. In the back.
Thanks, Professor. I just have a question about the civil wars of that you mentioned, and the relationship between the civil wars and also the destiny, the fate of Qing dynasty. Are there any events or decision making that you think those policymakers did it wrong that actually accelerated the death and the demolishing of the Qing dynasty?
I mean, with regard to the Southwestern rebellion in particular, which was what I was really mostly focusing on, you know, from the irony, I think, is that in the long run, they benefited from doing things wrong, right? So part of my argument is that the Qing had a kind of migrant that they thought they wanted, right? These solid farm families, right? They didn't want miners, loggers, et cetera, who they thought would either be kind of rowdy bunches of young unmarried men, right? Everybody knows that concentrations of young unmarried men are bad news. Nor did they want these guys to actually fit in with local society, right? Marry local women, partially acculturate. Either of those things got you labeled as hanjian, right? Instead, what they wanted, or what they thought they wanted, were, you know, solid farm families who would live in the Confucian way and civilize this place. And for a long time, very few such people moved to the far Southwest. Because after all, if you've already got a farm, why move to the frontier? Then around the turn of the 19th century, you have a series of natural disasters and other problems in places like Hunan and Jiangxi, and large numbers of farm families do begin to move, right? What will get a land-owning family to evacuate the area is something like a drought or a flood, right? And so beginning in the early 19th century, you get, or really in the 1790s actually, you begin to get a much larger flow of this other kind of migrant that the Qing originally thought were more desirable. And this is a perfect example of be careful what you wish for, you might get it. Because these migrants, as it turned out, were much more destabilizing. They come in large groups all at once, which makes it much harder to adjust to them. They want land, which is in scarce supply. Many of them, being solid farm families, are already married. They are not looking to intermarry with the locals and acculturate. And they have much more kind of cultural confidence because they didn't come from the absolute bottom of society. And they hold on to their identity, which again makes it much harder for the local society to absorb them. The Qing, on the other hand, saw them as much more desirable migrants. And so whereas when the older migrants, the ones who were frequently labeled as Hanjian, when they had conflicts with local society, the Qing often sided with the locals in order to keep the peace. When these newer migrants get into conflicts with local society, the Qing almost always back the migrants. And that, of course, just escalates the violence, because once the migrants figure out, hey, if we get into a fight with the locals, the magistrate's going to back us up. Any incentive they might have had to compromise goes away. And these migrants get more and more and more aggressive. And the so-called Panthay Rebellion in the Southwest is largely a kind of desperate defensive action by the local population against this emerging alliance of the state and the migrants. So from that point of view, you could say the Qing did everything wrong. The irony of it, though, is that in the long run, that new alliance between state and migrants ultimately, produces a conviction that even when things are really, really bad, we're not leaving, right? Whereas, as I said, otherwise you could imagine a situation where, given a mid-19th century situation where the Qing could barely hold Jiangsu, you could easily imagine them saying, the heck with Yunnan, who needs it? Certainly the heck with Xinjiang, right? Perfectly plausible that they might have retreated from a lot of the West. But under this new sort of way of thinking about these places and thinking about the migrants and thinking of them as our people in a way they hadn't thought of the earlier migrants, that becomes much less likely. And instead, they double down on controlling these areas. And though it takes several decades, they do eventually come up with the muscle to take full control. So yeah, they did a lot of things wrong. I mean, wrong both in the ethical sense and also in the practical sense that they, by being uncompromising, helped to touch off these, extremely bloody rebellions. The irony is that in the long run, their successors benefited from it.
I have 3 quick questions, but I will refrain asking all. But
Okay.
The first one on Zhongga, since the first question was about the Northwest Xinjiang.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with the notion that as a result of the joint effort, maybe I'm wrong, by expanding Russia and Emperor Kangxi to eliminate Zhongga, and that kind of empire building fences, fighting each other, do the Central Asia economy and the people, they kill 90% of the population, Zhongga people, as you mentioned. And that kind of effect has persisted to this day until the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Okay, I mean, certainly if by Central Asian people, you're implying a particular people who have a
the 5
right. I mean,
stands.
right. I mean, clearly the way of life that used to be common in that region is gone, right? And no modern state tolerates very much of it, right? Nomadic peoples all over the world have been clobbered over the last few centuries,
Right.
right? Whether it's in the Americas or whether it's in Central Asia or whether it's in Australia, you name it. And the assertion of territorial fixity, borders, et cetera, has obviously proved pretty much fatal to those lifestyles with a
Right.
handful of exceptions like parts of the Amazon. So yes, that I think is true. The question of whether for the people who today call themselves, let's say, Kazakhs, the ones who still exist, right? Whether their lives are worse than those of their, great-great-grandparents, I think that's much more complicated. But yeah, certainly in Central Asia as elsewhere, a series of ways of life have been destroyed, and that became possible, not inevitable, I would say, but possible when territorial states began expanding from both sides, right? If it had just been the Qing, then the Mongols could have handled the Qing advance the same way they'd handled earlier advances. You retreat, right? And since for every mile that you retreat into the steppe, the cost of warfare for an infantry army that has to move all its supplies goes through the roof, right? Retreat was actually a very, very effective method of defense for a long, long time. It's when retreat becomes impossible because there are these people coming from the other side that total victory from the Qing perspective or total defeat from the indigenous perspective becomes possible.
Thank you. In the Chinese history research circle, I don't know whether this is a common concept. They have a kind of a new area called the 边疆学, frontier history. Obviously, versus central China focused, like central peripheral type of concept. Do you agree with that, the notion or delineation, distinction?
I mean, the notion is a very, very general one. And I think some really good work has been done under that rubric.
Okay.
There's, in fact, one of the challenges I would say for a scholar these days is that there are just all these publications popping up in places like Yunnan and Guizhou, doing local history and doing local history in ways, often quite good quality local history, which means that you have to read it. It becomes a lot of work. So yes, there's a lot of good work being done. At the same time, I don't think that can replace the view from the center, right? It complements it, right? But you can't wish away the enormous power of both the government based in, well, in Chinese terms, in Nadi, or the enormous resources of private citizens moving out of those places, especially once those two groups start to work together, rather than, as I said in my talk, often working as cross purposes, back when the Ming and Qing didn't trust the migrants. So yeah, there's the Bianjiang Xue has produced a lot of really good work. It's not enough to, there's no such thing as a truly self-sufficient history of the border regions, because by definition, they're the borders of something, and that something has to be taken into account.
One
We're
last
supposed to
question,
end at 8,
Ken?
so I guess
Yeah.
one more question. Yeah.
One more.
Qing Empire.
Um,
So I would imagine it took tremendous resources.
It did take tremendous resources. It's not in the end what topples the Qing, right? I mean, the events that topple the Qing happen elsewhere. And one of the real ironies is that it's actually a lot of the modernizing, state strengthening institutions that the Qing were building that topple the Qing, right? I mean, it's an army mutiny, and it's actually the modern units that start the mutiny. So, I mean, certainly all that expansion was a tremendous strain, but compared to other things, it's probably not decisive. Again, the governments make all kinds of choices, some of which are very ugly. And so, for instance, the Qing in the 1870s, when they are faced with 3 challenges at once, one is a Northwestern rebellion, one is a massive famine in North China, and one is the need for a naval buildup to try and defend their coastline against what they accurately perceive to be dangers from the Western powers. And they choose, actually, to prioritize the naval buildup and the suppression of the Northwestern Rebellion. And they give short shrift to the famine relief in North China. And it's a horrible human tragedy. And a lot of Chinese civilian elites were infuriated by it. But it would be telling a kind of nice just so story to say, oh, and that's why the Qing fell. But the reality is that isn't why the Qing fell, right? The people who died in the famine died, and they didn't bring down the Qing. Other forces brought down the Qing.
You mentioned in your earlier presentation that the Han Chinese are divided between the Southern Han Chinese and Northern Chinese. I read a little bit in the genetics analysis. Do you agree with that kind of a division or delineation or that kind of a contrast?
It's actually more complicated than that. And we don't really have time to go into it, but what the genetic research, as I understand it now, is showing is if you track mitochondrial DNA, which comes exclusively from the mother's side, then the story that I gave you earlier is 100% true, right? That the Northern Han are surprisingly different from the Southern Han, and the Southern Han are much more like the other minorities, indicating that they have the same mothers. If you track Y chromosome DNA, which comes exclusively through the fathers, the story is more complicated. And if you track DNA that could come from either side, you get a blurry picture in between. So I oversimplified a bit, but I think the key point for our purposes is that there is simply no way to deny that very large numbers of people today classified as Han have at least a substantial genetic component that came from indigenous people who in one way or another changed identity, whether by choice or by force, but they didn't simply disappear. And lots of people who today are quite confident that they are 100% Han are genetically speaking anything but, the same way as in many other parts of the world, people who are absolutely sure that they belong to one population turn out to be mixture.
Thank you so much, Ken, for the very thoughtful discussion this evening, and thanks everyone for coming. If you just give me 1 minute, because I will need to share the our campus activities with you. So the first thing is that we are currently having our exhibition on tram Tales 120 Years of Hong Kong Tramways, to which Ken has contributed a lot to its content. We are extending the exhibition until August 31st this year. So if you have not had a chance to visit the tram exhibition, I would recommend you to do so. Thank you. So the second thing is that in this coming summer, our team will work with the UChicago Data Science Institute to offer the very first Data Science Summer Academy on our campus. So we will offer a 3-week in-person program on this campus for high school students to learn data science, AI, machine learning, coding, etc. So if you wish to know more about this program, please scan the QR code and recommend it to your family and friends, children, high school children, okay? Last but not least, we also are just launched our season 2 of the course podcast. This features career story of UChicago faculty members, has been released, version 2. You may listen to their inspiring stories on all the streaming platforms about how and why they joined academia. Lastly, I will encourage you to visit our UChicago website, www.uchicago.hk, and subscribe to our newsletter so that you will be able to know about events and programs like tonight. So once again, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the evening. Have a great evening. Thank you.